you. So I want to say, first of all, I'm sort of profoundly excited by your theoretical project, but I want to ask something fairly concrete. And that's about sort of a revival of a new indie fashion industry, and whether there's any, do you think there's any significance in the fact that often the people making those clothes have a sort of anti-capitalist stance or an environmentally friendly stance, and if this is somehow connected to what you've drawn out here?
Would you like me to answer that now? Yeah? Okay, well that's a really interesting point, because the original work certainly emerged out of critical, if you like, post-punk feminist kind of punk feminist impetus from the early 80s onwards, and in many ways connected with the explosion of British popular music at that time as well. The revival of indie fashion, I would say, is, I mean, it's, first of all, it's very recent, last 2 years. Secondly, I would say it sort of, what makes me feel it's impossible to say that one could see a kind of source of political resistance or opposition here is because it's really more because of the way in which youth culture has become the kind of leading edge for almost instant capitalist incorporation, whether it's through YouTube or MySpace, or whether it's through girls with their blogs immediately being picked up by companies, or whether it's through the kind of stuff that actually Naomi Klein talks about, immediately the way in which companies will kind of like operate with a kind of no label indie kind of cultural anthropologists on board to tell them what's going on. So I'm kind of skeptical about, so my first answer would be to be wary about seeing the kind of new eco-fashion or the rise of indie fashion as you know, kind of critical in a deep way, although I think it's quite clear that the fashion industry is having to think about these issues, but you know, I don't hold out. But then also I think the second reason that I would, and this is a kind of vernal point about to see new forms of indie fashion as being to an extent anti-capitalist would be to forget or to overlook the way in which individualization is so incredibly now institutionalized in a kind of deep way that and is so plugged in also to celebrity culture that I think that the only way in which we might be able to read the kind of reappearance of some of the things that I was talking about back in the late 1980s would be to see it, would be to imagine it, to kind of create a political imaginary which is actually very different from the ones that either went before, and we haven't got that as yet. So I would say, you know, like to put it very crudely, you know, you could imagine somebody like Peaches Geldorf or Kate Moss with her own indie ecological dress shop, you know, or immediately appearing on within the kind of mainstream magazine industry. So I think one would have to, I mean, I think that one has to do would have to have a kind of more a deeper analysis and critique for that to emerge.
Thank you so much for that paper. I loved it, and I really liked a lot the readings you gave us too. I detected in the paper a tension between an ethnographer's faith on the interviews and the voice and the experience and the reflection of the agents or the actors that are being interviewed. The tension between that with a more sociological attention to political and infrastructural considerations, so that you were aware that some of the blind spots on your subjects' awareness of their own situation had to do with fundamental political and infrastructural or even normative legal changes. Along the lines of blindness, then, something that perhaps does not, I do not know the UK situation that well to be able to say so, but the little I know indicates that maybe it is transferable. In the US, it seemed to me, and it has been raised before in this context, many of the jobs you described, many of the women, the working women that you analyze, would actually depend on other working women of ethnic background doing for much less money, but considerable higher degrees of exploitation, the work that they cannot perform in order for them to be able to do what you describe. And I wonder if this blind spot is something that is relevant for the UK and can be incorporated, or is just not necessarily applicable?
Well, actually, that's a great question. In many ways, that answers the question that you raised precisely in terms of a kind of the way in which it would be too easy to read into, like setting up a little shop and calling it kind of anti-capitalist. You're absolutely right. And in fact, I mean, I've got 2 or 3 quick responses to your question. First of all, I think it's absolutely the case, and maybe this is just a kind of dilemma of working in this kind of odd cultural studies way that I do, that and that other people here also do. But I think it's kind of very hard to combine political analysis with theoretical abstraction with doing kind of interviews and ethnography. You know, it's kind of quite hard to keep that balance going, and to kind of do justice in all 3 levels. And in many ways, I can see why it might be a much better strategy just to do the field work and to do the ethnography and to kind of let the politics and the theory emerge from that. So I think it really is quite difficult because it gives rise to so many questions about precisely for example, the kind of extent, we talk about this in my seminars with my students, the extent to which in this sector, when you're interviewing people, they are already very self-reflexive, yes? They're already, if you like, performative subjects. And so when you are carrying out interviews, they often will deploy precisely the kind of critical vocabulary that they either picked up in school or that they get in a kind of second-hand way from magazines. And so, I mean, without doing them an injustice or without kind of like, you know, there is always, if you like, the good faith of the interviewer whose relationship with the subject is one of kind of trust and openness, and there has to be, but at the same time, in this field, the normative subject in this field is trained to be a performing subject who demonstrates the self and who promotes the self and who also will in many ways deliver material to you in an interview, which is almost like a kind of PR document, like a press release. So that kind of like really is a great challenge to, you know, this kind of cultural sociology, where the person that you're interviewing is like recycling your own conceptual language. And actually, this has been written about by one of my PhD students, whose thesis you can probably read or you can email. His name is Boris Euenstein. And he now works for McKinsey in Berlin. But for a while he did a study of reflexivity amongst cultural workers in London and Berlin. And this was precisely the kind of dilemma that he engaged with, this high level of sophisticated reusing, if you like, implementing certain kinds of, and
Can I interrupt there, because at the theoretical level that's a really great comment, and I would really like to get this paper. But
I know I'm going to come on to
more practical.
Yeah.
And I thought this women's labor depends on 2 conditions, likely here in the U.S. at least. Domestic labor that is provided by ethnic workers,
yeah, sure,
which are oftentimes women,
sure,
and sweatshop conditions,
sure,
that make sure
yeah,
that those 2 doesn't...
Absolutely, no, I was going to get onto that. But just to hold on with the reflexivity point for a second, there's also a German sociologist called Bastian Lang, L-A-N-G, Bastian Lang, at the Center for Metropolitan Studies at University of Humboldt University, who's also done interviews with workers where he comments on this kind of superb sense of reflexivity in this kind of interview forum, and he kind of reflects on that as well. So no, you're totally right. So my first point was really a kind of methodological point. The second one about yes, precisely the okay. Now what's, you see, again, it's, in some ways it connects with the first point, that this area of culture industry research has only, let's say, in the last 2 or 3 years, even had a category of the worker, yeah? And maybe that's why we welcome the work of Hart and Lazzarato and Vernal, because they bring into this terrain notions of working class struggle. You know, they actually reintroduce the worker in a way that a few odd people like myself and Andrew Ross, in a different kind of way. And we got so scolded because then people said, well, they're not really workers, they're really an elite, so you can't call fashion designers workers. So we got kind of pretty hammered for actually talking about labour practices. And Andrew Ross actually is the one person who has been doing this consistently from his book No Sweat. And the No Sweat collection by Andrew was an absolute turning point, because that's exactly where he brought together people who were working as fashion designers, but he also, at that great conference in NYU, how many years ago, had people from the apparel trade union, had Chinese women trade unionists working in sweatshops in New York. So it is conceivable that you can kind of connect these levels of work together from, if you like, a radical, traditional labour perspective. It can be done. But by and large, this whole field, apart from the theory of Negri and Hart and Lazzarato and Vernal, has really not been conducted along the lines of a kind of, if you like, Marxist vocabulary or a kind of workers' struggle vocabulary. This is really one of the reasons why I think we are, to me it's welcome, because most of the discussion has been around cultural policy, you know, or about whether new labour can kind of you know, put more money into this sector. So the creative industry debate in the UK has been very much carried out at the level of the new economy, and about, you know, neoliberal values have been. So the debate we've been having has been very much challenging the neoliberalisation of this sector, or challenging the privatisation of the Arts Council. So we've been defensive in terms of challenging neoliberalisation rather than going back and thinking about workers' rights. Yeah? So in a sense, I'm beginning to kind of, that's what I'm trying to, so your point about, actually, about the sweatshop underpinning the fashion design production. Well, actually, you're completely right, and at the very, I have to say, this is a bit defensive, but the very last chapter of my book, I make this point very, very strongly, and I say, actually, the problem, that one of the reasons that this indie fashion is unviable is because there isn't a coming together of, in a kind of fair and equitable manner, of the traditionally low-paid, often Asian or Chinese women working in sweatshops only a couple of miles down the road from where the fashion designers are trying to live out their lives as fashion designers. And actually they're literally almost living next door to each other, but because they don't have a vocabulary of labour, of pay and conditions, of health and safety, of what it is to be manufacturing, and because they've only been trained in a way which kind of is rather looking down at labour practices. So again, throughout my book, I'm always saying, you know, these fashion designers are always saying to me, oh, I can't sew, you know, I don't know about sewing. And they never visited a factory. And so, you know, I kept saying, but, you know, how can you be a fashion designer and not sew, you know? And actually that was because that was part of their pedagogy at that time. And so in a kind of little utopian moment at the very end, I said, well, if we're going to talk about policy, one of the ways that we would do it would be to bring together and train up and offer good access to the very hundreds of Asian small sweatshops where women are employed next door to these fashion designers. So, you know, I think actually that is the kind of the better political point to make that you've just made. And I think kind of Andrew Ross did that really with his book No Sweat. You know, he tried to bring that together in a kind of grander scale. So he had the head of the AFL-CIO and the, you know, representatives of the sweatshop in New York alongside fashion journalists and a few fashion designers at a conference that was about 8 years ago at NYU. And you've just had him talk, so you know who I'm talking about.
Over by the door.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the connection between passionate work and romantic investment in terms of sort of the production of these designs and the inability of certain designers to successfully sell a majority of their pieces. And I'm thinking of sort of Chalayan's recent collaboration with Swarovski, wherein he says, like, you know, I wouldn't imagine there. So the collection is sort of like he makes these dresses, right, from the very little that I know, that are kind of like constructed really elaborately by like rubies. I don't know if you've seen this, but
No, could you say that again? Who the designer is?
Chalayan. Chalayan.
Oh, Hussein. Oh, Chalayan. Yeah.
And so the recent collaboration between him and Swarovski.
Yeah.
And so these rubies sort of, there's this sort of elaborate like construction with rubies, and you know, he says, you know, I would never dream of selling one of these pieces. And there's a sort of, also like Gareth Pugh, a lot of his pieces he wouldn't, they're just not buyers there for
Sure.
like a lot of these pieces. And I'm wondering if you can like say a little bit about
Sure.
passionate work and this kind of, you know.
Yeah. Okay, well, I can, my immediate response to your point is, does kind of connect also with the last point, in that when I was trying to think in policy terms of how could this, all of these people who are trained and who are all talented, how could it produce something that was, that didn't just like disappear or end up in Marks and Spencer's or in, you know, big corporate. And I suppose what I wanted to make the argument that fashion design should actually also be able to define itself within a kind of fine art world, really. Fine art in terms of it should be possible for designers to kind of get the same kind of state subsidies as you can if you're, well, or you try to if you're an artist. And instead of actually always having to kind of think in terms of proper manufacturing and going and having to deal with large-scale production, they should be able to both keep, they should be able to be small-scale and work in a local way, along the lines of what I just described, in a way that had access to state subsidy as a kind of investment in cultural resources. So they shouldn't be entirely privatized, was the one argument. But I also thought that, and I argued, that people like Hussein Chalayan and many others were really more like artists than they were fashion designers. You know, that was their passion, their romantic self-identity was really to be working with kind of like shows, like putting on a show, rather than actually being rag trade, you know, mass manufacturers like Marks and Spencer's. So I kind of wanted to think about how that would be viable, but government weren't at all interested, and it kind of like that issue dropped off the agenda. But I still think it's actually I think it's intellectually correct to see that it's unlikely that all the people who are trained as fashion designers can actually become the equivalent of chain street. And, you know, chain street stores dominate fashion anyway. So all they're going to do in the end is end up as kind of low-level design assistants, where they could be doing their own artwork, and they could be. And so that was really the. But then the third point really would be, however, in the last 5 years or so, in the UK particularly, but also elsewhere, there's this kind of grand inflation of artwork. You know, there's a kind of, again, another romantic obsession with art has become a sort of signal it's become a kind of utopia, really, of an escape route from, and also, of course, also perhaps a point of kind of political investment, that somehow being an artist is now a kind of solution to the problems of the culture industries. And we can talk about that a bit more later, but it's of course, it is individualized, it's romanticized, it is escapist. And it's become, I don't know, I mean, Kate would also know about this as well, but somehow, as the other sectors of the field become unviable, like a good example would be, it's impossible to be a filmmaker now in the UK, but we train so many people in film. You know, hundreds and thousands of young people are being trained to make films. It's impossible to be an independent filmmaker in a way that will earn you a living, but you can get a gallery and define yourself as an artist. And you can become a kind of artist, really. And the artist is, again, as I said a few minutes ago, is the kind of no investment, no pay mark of self and identity. So there's something around becoming an artist has become a mark of all of this illegibility, really. And I think Hussein Chalayan kind of absolutely fits that completely. I mean, I like his work, actually. And I think he's somebody who's kind of like really tried every conceivable option. You know, he worked for Topshop. You can buy, but he probably lost that contract, because the great kind of the myth about the chain store looking after the designers is that, whether it's Topshop in the UK or Marks and Spencer's, you know, like what government bought into was that, okay, fashion design is no longer sustainable, it's not viable. What Angela's talking about, forget it. We're not going to subsidise fashion designers. I mean, even the Minister of Culture guy said to me, he said, oh, Angela, you're such a bleeding heart liberal. He said, we're not going to be providing money for people to be setting up stalls in Camden Market for the next 20 years. You know, are you joking? So, you know, they then said, okay, we leave it to the private sector. The chain stores will employ the designers, and give them a slot, and actually the chain stores, like Debenhams or whatever, but the chain stores only employ the designers for like 6 months, and then they drop them and take the next lot. So, you know, I don't know. It would be interesting to know how Hussein Chalayan actually works, you know, and he's one of the ones who has kind of retained some, some presence in the field. There's so much research to be done here, you know. Sorry, I'm getting a bit tired. I'm not sure if these questions, my answers are becoming less coherent.
3 more questions.
This is going to take us maybe definitely in a different direction. My work is this is why I'm asking this question. My work is about the way in which the creative industries impact labor in the domestic space. Yeah. And so I've really enjoyed your talk and the readings. And in the one reading that we did, there was a discussion about the problematics of separating out productive and reproductive labor, and how it is that perhaps if we can look instead to a different kind of framework, one that asks questions about what is work and what is life, that we might be able to better deal with some of these questions. So I guess what I want to ask of you is to what degree then can we make portable the analyses of effective labor when they're about work for pay that has to do with making a livelihood into an analysis of something like crafting in the home as a part of what it means to be a mom or a grandmother. So if you could help me understand a little bit more about what you make of the portability of those things, that would be really helpful to me.
Okay, well, I would say that that we have to begin to try to analyze in a more sustained way the kind of, if you like, boundary marking practices between work and life itself. And, this notion of the erosion of boundaries, the way in which life itself takes over and subsumes work, or work subsumes life, seems to me one of the most interesting points from Lazzarato. But it's gestural, we really need to kind of I mean, he gives us something really important to think about, something that we all experience, and also something that is part of our academic working practices. You know, and this was another reason why I was very defensive when the old Marxist left ticked me off for being romantic, because and saying these girls, you know, are all just like a middle-class elite working night and day. Actually, you know, we are all invested in a semi-romantic way, in many ways, in our own production. So I think that what is really welcome about the Italian work is that it gives us a political vocabulary, a leftist, feminist political vocabulary for thinking about what happens when work in the old sense is transformed into something which is either more meaningful or more intellectual or more personally rewarding, or where people seem to be more able to pursue their desire in work, where work becomes something which is absolutely impregnated with desire, and where it is overwhelming, where those boundaries are absolutely porous. And in that paper that I wrote, which was very kind of sketchy around trying to then think about that from a feminist perspective, I was trying to think about, well, I find myself not satisfied with any of the more kind of practical responses to these questions about drawing more boundaries, or trying to kind of apply the old rules of work and life, like, for example, the work-life balance. You know, none of that seems to be able to really kind of help in this. So, I mean, I'm really kind of fudging about in relation to your question about, and that's why in this paper I don't like the utopianism. I mean, I think that utopianism is, forget it, you know, I've never been a utopian. But what I tried to do in that paper was to think about areas where there was productivity of both affect in a way that wasn't beholden to capital. So that isn't to say that it was entirely outside a capitalist rationality, but where there was a kind of collective, affective investment, for example, in childcare, in a specific socio-historical context, but which was either alternative, and of course we can't talk about alternative anymore in the politics of immanence, but nevertheless, maybe that's an answer also to the other question about, you know, well, there isn't an alternative anymore, but, you know, what is it to be inside, and what does it mean to be trying to reimagine some notion of communality, or like, you know, what is it, community without community, the sort of Agamben community, I don't know, but so childcare seemed to me the best example, because I think in childcare there is an ethos of looking after a de-individualizing kind of maternalist ethics, which is about caring for other people. You know, the communal nursery was a place where people looked after other people's children in a non-pay way. And actually mothers do that anyway, even outside a nursery. So that was a kind of a non-utopian kind of... So I was looking for examples of in relation to your question. And that was probably one that I kind of... the only one I could come up with, because it exemplified a care ethic in a way that also wasn't essentialized. It wasn't just about mothers, you know?
Such a great presentation. And you began to answer the question I had. A concept that's been floating around here is that of the precariat.
Yeah.
Right? And what you've just articulated is a real division within that, you know, between, say, the sweatshop workers and the designers, who both have very different sets of interest, even though their labor is both precarious. And you gave us this great phrase, a vocabulary of labor, right, to talk about, you know, taking collective interest into account. But what I wonder about is, how do you move from a vocabulary of labor to, say, institutions of labor, in which some kind of collective guaranteed a certain minimum provisions are accessible generally? I mean, that still seems to be the challenge, and I say this coming from the restaurant industry in a previous life, where some of the same kinds of things are certainly in evidence. Thanks.
Well, that's another really great question, and I'm trying to think about how could one, within these kind of, especially within project-to-project working, how could one kind of reconstitute some notion of collectivity and responsibility for the other in the workplace, or, if you like, a kind of old trade union ethos of representation and fairness and equity and so on. And I think really at this stage, all one could do is to flag that question. How can you do it in project-to-project working? You know, and what would it take, and how might one put that onto a certain kind of intellectual as well as a political agenda? And that's only. But the second answer to your question is that. I mean, there are some theorists who might see the old institution as a kind of a thing of the past. The old public sector is so completely changed, and institutions are endlessly being kind of disaggregated and made kind of again opaque, so that you don't know where an institution begins and where it ends, and what kind of subcontracting chains it's got, and who is a net employee and who isn't. And we can see this in the university as well. But there are some theorists who are kind of like, or not, you know, sociologists who recently are kind of like trying to think, how is it just a question, can one kind of defend institutions again, you know? What would it take to defend bureaucracy and to kind of like reinstate a vocabulary of bureaucracy and institutions and kind of safeguards within this world of disappearing boundaries? And the person one person in the UK who's writing about bureaucracy is a Foucault scholar, a friend of mine, Paul Duguay. And he's written recently, I think actually 2 volumes about bureaucracy. I have to say I've only read about 1 chapter from one, but I would say that's his project. It's also the project of, in many ways, of Zygmunt Bauman, you know? You could say this is a Bauman project. But the second, and it's, you know, so that would be Bauman and Paul Duguay would say, let's revalue the public sector and the institutions. Then there are some EU, some people, 2 other colleagues of mine, Nigel Thrift and Ash Amin, who are writing a book about Europe. And it's a defense of big institutions, you know, the EU, the Council of Europe, the Strasbourg agreements, you know, all the legislation is tied up around employment law that is still in this huge machinery of the EU. And they argue that, you know, we have to kind of re-centralize the significant, I mean, it doesn't work so much in America, but in Europe, this is a kind of huge machinery of post-national kind of governmentality. And so for example, precisely, discrimination that as a freelance worker, which wouldn't get to the courts in Britain, could conceivably go to the EU, you know. So I think that's the second answer to your question, that there is a kind of slow momentum, towards kind of revaluing the large-scale institution. I think that's the best I can say in relation to that point.
Okay, last question.
Okay, I make this very short. because you already started to answer my question. At the beginning of your talk, you were referring to Werner and his idea of distributed politics that might be valuable for feminist politics to also to provide an answer to the post-feminist conditions in which women are working in creative industries. And maybe you could say a bit more about this, and also in connection to the Katie Weeks text that you put on our reading list, because I was slightly irritated by her utopianism and her idea of identity politics, which, yeah, maybe you can somehow say more a bit of this.
Yeah, okay, well, I mean, again, it sort of connects a little bit back to the other 2 points. That I find Werner really useful for thinking about education, learning, and the academy. And I think that in some way he leads us to kind of maybe invent a new politics of the university. And this would seem to me to be actually not just helpful in relation to the questions that we have been thinking about anyway, but actually it's also incredibly politically urgent, because the university increasingly plays a key role in the knowledge economy, in knowledge transfer, in all the kinds of requirements that we work with industry, that we provide industry with our research and so on. So in relation to the kind of a new feminist politics, and in relation to Werner, I think that there is an opportunity, or there is a potential. I mean, that's really, because the potential is that with the expansion of the sector in which we work, which still has got public sector underpinning, which still is really in many ways defined in the humanities and the social sciences along the lines of post-war social democratic, but also taking into account post-colonial discourse. There are some, if you like, there are some battles that we have almost won. And those battles that we have won are in the curriculum, in the kind of, we've challenged the canon of the humanities and the social sciences. And we have certain kinds of, so at that level, I think that there is a connection, even with the woman in a sweatshop. And I talk about this at the very end of my feminist book, that where there seem to be huge disparities and kind of enormous discrepancies between rich and poor, and a kind of hopelessness politically. Within that hopelessness, education maybe provides a kind of bridge of possibility. And so the way in which, in the post-war period, with social democratic institutions being able to implement, for example, access to learning, so that women in sweatshops can come and do evening classes. These are the kind of small facilities and resources that I think are really not just something that we defend, but something that we turn into a new kind of politics. Maybe that's the point, that it's not just a question of defending battles that might have just been won and no more, and not just defending them against them being completely and absolutely destroyed, but actually trying to turn them into something that, and I think people like Raymond Williams and that cultural studies tradition always had that kind of ethos as well. Is that an answer to Kathy Weeks? I read it quickly. I can't remember it. I'm sorry. It's sort of gone out of my head. Actually, all I felt was that I just thought it was a useful piece, because, but I thought it was kind of odd that she just concentrated on Arlie Hochschild and dear old C. Wright Mills, who I could hardly remember from,
Okay. We need to move on, but
anyway.
thank you very much for fleshing out.